Welcome everyone to this afternoon session of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. Once again, we are looking at pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft Building Safety Bill. This is a legislation that is going to put into effect, hopefully, safer buildings post-Grenfell to make sure that the Grenfell disaster never happens again. That's clearly the objective we all have in mind. Just before we move on to our witnesses this afternoon, I just want members of the committee to have a chance to put on record any interest they may have that may be particularly relevant to this inquiry. I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association. If members could just raise their hand. Mary, if you like to come in.
I employ a councillor in my staff team.
Okay. Ben?
I'm a unitary councillor in Buckinghamshire.
Mohammed?
I'm here.
Yes, sorry. No, you haven't. Sorry. Bob?
Yes, Bob Blackman. I'm a Vice President of the LGA, and I also employ a councillor in my office.
Right. Two Ians. Ian Levy, then Ian Byrne. Ian Levy.
I employ a councillor in my office as well.
Right. Ian Byrne.
I'm still assisting councillor in Liverpool Chair.
Right. Abhinav?
I employ councillors in my office as well.
And Rachel?
And I'm still a sitting councillor on Luton Council.
Okay. Is that everyone? Okay. Thank you very much for that. Now over to our witnesses, and we have two panels this afternoon of three witnesses on each panel. If I just ask each witness in turn, if you could just say who you are and what organisation you're here representing. Could I begin with Dr. Debbie Smith?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the invitation to participate today in the evidence session. My name's Dr. Debbie Smith, and I'm Director of Science and Professional Development at BRE Group. I joined what was the Fire Research Station at BRE in 1984 and have been working in many areas associated with the environment, in research, testing and certification and consultancy since then. I've been heavily involved over the years in the developments of the new European fire test methods and classification standards, and have attended standards and developed guidance, both national and international standards arenas. I also hold the chair of the European Committee on Fire Safety Standards, and I'm also currently the CEN Construction Sector Rapporteur, chairing the CEN Sector Forum for Construction within Europe.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, just could you say the BRE? Could you just explain the full terminology? Because there'll be people watching perhaps who aren't aware. Yeah. So you're muted. Sorry, we can't hear you. So we still can't hear you. You're on mute. Sorry. Right. So we couldn't hear those last comments. You're on mute. Yeah. Still on mute.
Right.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Yeah. So BRE is the Building Research Establishment, and it's a group of companies that have worked for nearly 100 years in terms of looking after construction-related issues associated with the built environment.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay.
Peter Capelhorn? You're muted as well. Yes.
I'm so sorry.
It's all right. It happens to all of us, don't worry.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter Capelhorn. I'm the Chief Executive of the Construction Products Association. Prior to joining the association, I was in practice as a commercial architect. During that time, I was on the RIBA Council for 10 years. I also was Deputy Chair of the Building Regs Advisory Committee for 10 years. And I currently also hold the role of chairing the BSI, British Standards Institute CB-Committee, which is the Strategic Committee on All Construction Matters, And finally, probably of interest, was that I was involved in 3 of the working groups on Dame Judith's report and review before it was published. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Scott Steedman.
Yes, good afternoon, Chair. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. My name is Scott Steedman. I'm an Executive Director of the BSI Group and Director of Standards for the British Standards Institution. So I have primary responsibility for the National Standards Body and the British representation in the international and the European regional standards organisations. So that covers ISO and the IEC in Geneva, and CEN and CENELEC that Debbie's just mentioned in the European regional context, and of course all the national standards. So I was an academic early in my career in the built environment, and then moved into industry and spent about 20 years in industry in various companies, consulting and design, briefly in contracting, and heavily in research and development and knowledge. So when I moved to BSI to take on this role in 2012, I thought it was particularly exciting because of the opportunity to use standards as best practice to drive performance improvement in industry. And we've seen a number of examples of that in the last few years. So I welcome this opportunity and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, the 3 of you, for coming, and we'll obviously explore some of those issues in greater detail. But just first of all, as I said at the beginning, the ultimate objective of this legislation is to ensure that we don't have another tragedy like Grenfell. So overall, and I'll just go round the witnesses and indicate who to answer first, second and third, if that's okay. Overall, do you welcome the proposals, and do you think they're going to do that job, effectively preventing another Grenfell? So I'm going to come first of all to Debbie Smith.
Oh, thank you very much, Chairman. Yes, on behalf of BRE, we do welcome this bill. It's a very important bill, and we welcome the commitment to the fundamental reform of the building safety system. It's greatly needed, and in its current form, it provides a helpful framework, and it broadly encompasses the issues that face the sector. However, what has been set out and has been touched on by previous witnesses, there's still, the framework as it exists is very much a framework, and there's still an awful lot of detail that still needs to be worked through in terms of secondary legislation and a clear detail of how the elements will work in practice. We welcome the scrutiny of this bill by this committee. We think it's an important step, and it's very important that we will end up with a robust piece of legislation that serves the sector for very many years to come.
Right, and moving on, next we could have Peter Capelhorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Overall, I would say that the construction products arena as a whole welcome this bill. I think it does set out the scene very well, but as Debbie has said, there is a lot of detail clearly yet to be worked through. I think there are particular concerns that I would just like to highlight. Firstly, there needs to be a little bit of a focus on project process and project chronology, which I think may cause us problems in some of the details going forward. I think we have yet to fully define building safety risk, and I think there are a number of issues with regards to the product area, with regards to buildings being complex entities, and products on their own aren't necessarily easily definable, and I think there would be a need to focus on that in particular. But I would just like to draw out also the fact that procurement and building contract are not yet touched by the provisions in the bill, and as we saw from Dame Judith's analysis, she identifies that those drive behaviour in the current industry. And if we are to look at cultural change across the whole industry, those need to be taken account of. Thank you.
Right. So you think, just following up a quick question on that, do you think there are therefore a need either for further legislation or for adding to this legislation?
Yes, indeed. Yes, I think possibly that can come out in secondary legislation, but certainly there's some key principles there that do need to be addressed.
Okay, right, and Scott Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I mean, we welcome this bill. I mean, the draft bill is very clear commitment from the government of its interest in fundamental reform of the building safety system, which is great news. It's been a long time coming. I'd like really also to say that actually in the last couple of years, as we've worked on this, the commitment in the department by ministers and officials in HC&LG towards this work has been really exemplary, actually. And it's been a privilege working with them on this. They have really tried very hard to bring this bill to the stage we're at. So that's been great news. It is, as Debbie and Peter have said, still a partial picture. And in a sense, it has to be, because sitting below this, there will be a huge manner of documents. The approved documents alone include references to over 480 British standards. So when we use the word standard, which I will be doing this afternoon quite a lot, what I'm referring to are the non-legislative standards that BSI is responsible for. And I can't discuss standards in connection with regulatory requirements, for example, but these industry-led standards that support the whole system. So the partial picture that Debbie and Peter referred to is very important. We will need to see the supporting regulations and guidance to see how the whole thing will work together. And I think Peter's point about procurement is a good example of another area that, whether that comes in future guidance, that new standards could be used to support cultural change in that area. That would be an area of interest. The golden thread, I'm sure that we'll touch on with the staff.
We will,
there
yes.
Are other
yes.
But the fact that competence is woven through this whole bill, it seems to me a real breakthrough, actually, a transformational opportunity to tackle the question of competence at a strategic and tactical level.
Right. I just want to come back to products, but just wind it out slightly in view of what Peter Caplethorne said. So there are 3 designations for products in the legislation. Is that right? Is it clear what it means to everybody who's going to be involved? But just picking up on something that Peter Caplethorne said, and I want to therefore pose this question to him first. You mentioned it was a bit more complicated than that in the building industry, and certainly one product that might be perfectly safe in isolation becomes a different matter when it's installed with another product alongside. So the issue of combinations of products and the issue of how products are fitted, has that got to be taken into account more clearly around this whole issue of designation? Peter Caplethorne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And absolutely, yes. I think it is really complicated when you're trying to analyse the performance of any particular part of the building. And the best way I can describe this, I think, for your benefit and the committee's benefit, is to pick an example that's actually in the guidance in the published document. And they refer to a failure of a brick tie within that document. So for people not connected with construction, a brick tie is a piece of metal which holds 2 leaves of brickwork or masonry together. And it's a primary structural element, but the guidance is pointing out that a failure of brick tie would be clear and would be something that would be subject to sanction, etc., etc. Now, unfortunately, I would say that a failure of brick tie can be down to design, because it could be that it was designed wrong in the first place. It could be down to the fact that it was procured wrongly, because the wrong size was actually bought in the process leading to construction, or it could be installed badly because those doing the installation were incompetent. So I hope by that simple example I'm explaining that there are many other levels that we need to focus on to ensure that we do achieve safe buildings, and just focusing in on at the product level is not necessarily going to give us the answers we all desire.
Right, so how do you write that into legislation?
Good question. I think the key thing is to take account of products and product assemblies, and as Dame Judith said in her report, regard buildings as holistic entities. So the analysis that the legislation has to work through is based upon a number of different levels not just focusing in on products in the first case.
Right, Scott Steedman, I see you wanted to come in. Yes, follow up, please. Yes.
I thought that was a very interesting line, and the way this is tackled, in my view, is to see the buildings as a system, as Peter describes, and to recall that at the top level, the ambition is to avoid, as you indicated yourself, a major incident in the future. But the bill is also discussing not only the competence around the regulated roles at the top of the system, where we need people who have an understanding of the fact a brick tile might fail in multiple different ways, to the competence of the whole system. So there's quite a complexity here, quite a burden on the regulator to tackle not only the higher risk buildings, where the ambition is avoiding a major incident, but also in the long fullness of time, tackling the quality of all building works. And so there's a kind of competence from the top down, which is new, frankly, and we have to bring it into this industry. And that's what's happening with the competence framework standards. And then there's the general issue around culture, quality, and performance of work of individual operatives and professionals in the built environment, who have to have more understanding and awareness of the impact of their work on others. So treating the built environment and higher risk buildings as systems, increasingly complex systems in the modern world, is something that we have to skill up, particularly at the higher levels of the community.
Right, Debbie Smith, follow
up? Yes, so yeah, that's a really interesting point that's been made, and I completely agree with the analogy. I think within the context of fire safety, it's also important to realise that we have a system that enables the testing and then the classification of products. But an important aspect to their classification is something called the field of application, which you find within the classification report. And within that, it tells you that, a given product might have several different classifications associated with it, depending on how you use it. And that might be how you fix it, or how you, whether it's got an air gap behind it, and how it's used in combination with other products. So some of the system, if you like, and process, certainly around fire safety, is already partially there and can be used now. And I would argue, it should be being used now. However, there's a real challenge around all of this, because what has become apparent since Grenfell is that a lot of people don't realise that. They don't validate the claims that are being made by manufacturers, and they don't look at the field of application in the reports. So you might install products in a way that does not deliver the performance that was required or intended. So this then stems back to the point Scott was just making about the competence of all of the professionals and the individuals that are working within the construction sector chain. And it's important that we educate people to look for the right information and then be able to discharge their responsibilities.
Right. One final question. I mean, currently, as I understand it, the regime, the only regime that applies in this area is the EU harmonised standard, or the European technical assessment. Now, I think the proposals allow for those standards or other overseas standards to be designated through regulation. Do you think that the European technical assessment should be on the face of the bill, or are there any other overseas standards that should be on the face of the bill as well? I'll begin this time with Scott Steedman.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I mean, these are British standards that we're talking about, developed with British input. So they are European regional standards that you're describing. Right. And as Debbie mentioned earlier, she chairs important committees in that area, and other British experts in the built environment chair very important design committees, the Eurocodes and so on. These are European regional standards. They're not related to the European Union. Right. So they're part of British standards as they exist in the United Kingdom. And post-transition, they will be designated. So they will carry on. So the body of standards developed and managed by committees led by Peter Capelhorn in BSI will continue with British input to those standards.
Should they be on the face of the bill?
I couldn't comment on whether the word Europe should be on the bill. The standards are British standards.
Right. Moving on then to Debbie Smith.
Well, just adding really to what Scott said, they are the only standards looking the performance of our construction products, and there are something of the order of 600 product standards, test standards, etc., that are supporting that framework. So if we didn't have those referred to, we really would have no basis moving forwards to implement the bill anyway.
Okay, anything to add, Peter Caplehorn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just add that the whole issue of how we take standards forward when we've gone through the transition period is likely to cause complexity in the marketplace and likely to cause a great deal of disruption to the objectives that we are trying to achieve under ensuring that buildings are safer. And the reason I say that is because the standards that we're talking about, although there are lots of them, do only cover a fraction of the marketplace. Now, the current provision within the bill is that where necessary, I think those are the words, additional standards will be drawn up. Now, these are complicated entities in their own right, and that will take a considerable amount of time. So I think the issue, we shouldn't get too focused on what we've got at the moment. I think we should be focused on what are we going to do in future. And for me, that's about ensuring that products where necessary are tested properly, are accredited properly and brought to market. Now, the issue there is that currently this is a part of a system driven by the Commission. We are moving to a system that's driven by the UK government. If we do not get all the details of that correctly organised, there will be an undermining of standards, and therefore potentially, as I say, it detracts us from our overall objective of making buildings safer.
Okay,
thank you. Oh, yes, sorry. Scott Stephen wanted to come back.
Thank you, Chair. Just a brief comment on that. The department, as I understand it, is exploring a new committee on standards, which is intended to take some responsibility for that post-transition, so that the designation of these standards in connection with UK legislation will be under the direction of the Secretary of State and advised by a committee on standards in the department. That's work in progress, as I understand it.
Okay, right. Thank you for those answers. And now I'm going to move on to Mary Robinson. Mary.
Thank you, Chairman. The second category under the construction products regulation is referred to as safety critical products. A product may only be included in that list if, in the view of the Secretary of State, any failure of the product would risk causing death or serious injury to any person. Do you think that that definition is specific enough? First to Debbie.
Thank you. The definition is, no, I don't think the definition is specific enough in broad terms. Basically, that it all hinges on your appreciation of risk and how you define risk. There is no quantification of that as things stand, and the system that's being proposed within the bill related to products that maybe sit outside of the construction products regulation and scope of that still need to be regulated does leave the door open for, if you like, a two-tier system to emerge where, you know, some products are treated more harshly than others because there is no sort of common definition and quantification of some of these things. So I guess the answer is that there is a lot more detail that is required to underpin what we have in the bill, and it will depend on what that detail says and whether that's in the form of secondary legislation or guidance or whatever. But that's, for me, that's a missing part of a gap within what the bill explains.
Scott, Stephen, you're nodding. Do you agree?
Yeah. Yes, Mary, I am agreeing. It's a very interesting question how you define risk, and it all depends on the scale of the system that you're looking at. And this is an area that the built environment as a sector needs to get to grips with. It's the kind of thing that BSI with its standards committees would tackle by getting a consensus of regulators and experts like Debbie and Peter and other industry and consumers as to what risk really meant. So that's the way that standards committees work, is that then there may be industry standards they produce, but they're a full stakeholder engagement process. And if you're going to try and understand risk with the residents at the center of it, then that's the way to do it, with a standards process where you can bring some deeper understanding. But risk itself is something that I think that the new regulated roles will really have to get their head around, because that's a piece of the whole safety agenda that has not been well understood in the industry hitherto. And maybe this is part of the background to where we are today. But trying to upskill that community to really understand what risk really means in practice on regular building projects rather than high-profile projects is a big challenge, and that's where the new competence standards will try to play a role.
Peter, would you say the same?
Yeah, I would, Mary. I do think, though, that the coming back to your original question, I don't think that the definition is strong enough, and I do come back to this point that I think we do have a section of further consideration which could be drawn out through the secondary legislation, but this is about identifying these issues at a practical, everyday level in the middle of the industry. And as I said earlier, there are many ways I can identify failure of a product or indeed safety risk within a project, and they aren't necessarily always the same thing or always defined in the same way. So the issue we're trying to home in on is complicated when you get to the coalface.
Okay, could I stay with you? Failure and injury were the words that were used, very specific. How wide do you think then they should be defined? And should the regulations include, for example, long-term exposure to toxic products as well as fire and structural safety?
I think they should spread wider, because I've always taken the view that this isn't, although we started with fire as obviously the major topic, but we should spread out to consider wider things. After all, our objective we keep coming back to is to make buildings safe for people, and safety in the round, as far as I'm concerned. There should not be anything that a building necessarily exhibits in its asset that actually contributes to people's problems in terms of well-being. Let me put it like that. So I'm very much on that case. But in doing that, we have to have a process of analysing risk. And I'd go back to, again, a thread which was brought out through Dame Judith's report, which is the use of the CDM regs as the foundation as to how we would take things forward. We've been very used to using a system of risk assessment through those regulations for a very long time. Extending that process, I think, could well be the way we take this forward.
Mm.
Thank you. Could I go to you, Scott, and then to Debbie? How widely do you think this should be defined?
Well, I think quite widely, but I think with some explanation, Mary, because disasters come in different forms, and whilst there is reference to a single event, actually risk and disasters could be slow onset as well as rapid onset. So a catastrophic fire is a sudden onset event, but a slow onset disaster could happen. And I'm thinking of asbestos or something like that. You could have a slow onset event that built up over a long period of time and brought a significant number of people were unacceptably injured or otherwise through some slow onset problem. So I think that in defining risk, that would be very important to be clear what it is we're trying to achieve. And if we're trying to prevent major loss, major injuries to a significant number of people at the top of the risk scale, that's one thing. If we're trying to make sure that everything is screwed to the wall and precise to the right place, that's another thing. So there's a whole different spectrum here. One end you've got quality of people's work, but making things that are of quality doesn't guarantee safety at all. And loads of examples where everybody can do what they're supposed to do on the day and it still falls down. Lots of examples of that. So this bill, as I understand it, is really the top end trying to prevent the occurrence and control the impact of a potential major incident. That's what this is about at the top end. So risk has got to be seen in that context. Significant numbers of people injured or tragically lost. And at the other end, we're trying to improve the general culture and quality of the built environment and the professionals and trades. And that all contributes to the other end, but it's not, they're not one for one and mapping. So I think defining risk more broadly is helpful, but in that context, slow onset, rapid onset.
Thank you. Dr. Smith.
Yes, thank you. I fully endorse what both Peter and Scott are saying on that. I think, again, it boils down to, it's just been identified really, the quantification of the risk and the focus in terms of what it is you're trying to prevent. So, yes, Grenfell was, a real tragedy with significant loss of life in one event. If we can address the quality issues and the competence issues and so on that are going to improve things within that spectrum, then it will certainly contribute elsewhere. And there are, other areas under the construction products regulation that would help with that as well. I mean, there are things like the dangerous substances part of the legislation and so on. So, maybe it needs a little better thought if there's still some grey areas in there.
Thank you. Can we just stay with you, Dr. Smith, and also stay with risk? In relation to the power to make provision in relation to the marketing and supply of construction products, the government can allow local requirements to go further than the central government measures if the local authority thinks the products risk causing death or serious injury to any person. Does this approach risk inconsistency and confusion?
Yes. I mean, of course, if you are in one area saying that a product is appropriate and safe to use in a particular application, but then is deemed not to be elsewhere, there is the possibility that you will start to get a mismatch in terms of the requirements in different areas, and that's clear. One would hope that the building safety regulator would start to play a role in that space, so that, if there were concerns about a particular product that was deemed to be safe somewhere, and they could then be raised and aired and looked at and considered as to why the view was different in a different part of the country or a different local authority. It would not really make a lot of sense if for a basic same building with the same risk profile and occupant characteristics, you had different requirements in different regions, in my opinion.
Scott Stegman, could I ask you, does this dual approach risk confusion?
Yes, it risks, a dual approach risks confusion, but we are living today with different regulations and different regulatory requirements in different parts of the United Kingdom. What we have in common is a set of standards that support product testing and so on. So that's the piece that I would be most worried about. If we started to fragment the standards, that would be really catastrophic. But it's quite possible if the authorities are in control. And I think of lots of other examples where we have different regulatory requirements in different parts of the United Kingdom, and we cope perfectly well. So Yes, I mean, there is scope for confusion, absolutely. We just would have to manage that. But at the end of the day, a regulatory requirement is a political decision. A standard is a consensus, stakeholder, industry-led decision. So common standards can support different regulatory requirements, common international standards, as well as British standards.
Thank you. Could I ask you, Peter, how you view this potential for inconsistency and confusion?
Well, I have to say, I think it's a recipe for disaster. And I think if we look at what's going on across the industry right now, whilst we do have different building regs for different devolved parts of the United Kingdom, we do have different approaches all the way across the country as to how the current building regs are applied. And without a doubt, that inherent confusion has resulted in poorer standards. So I would be very keen. I totally accept what Scott has said about coherent standards, and that's absolutely crucial. And if you like, that takes me back to my point about how things will change when we have completely left the EU. But if we just focus on actual application of standards, what we are looking at under this bill is stronger powers, stronger definition of roles and responsibilities, driving better quality, better outcomes. We definitely do not want to have anything in the procedures or in the regulations which gives people any doubt as to what is needed to be achieved. To me, that clause definitely is misplaced.
Thank you. Could I just come with one last question to you, please, Scott Steadman? The government will ask the British Standards Institution to review relevant existing standards and/or develop appropriate new ones for the identified products. What can you tell us about that process and how it will work?
We haven't had a formal request yet to do that, but we are working very closely with MHC&LG, and it works very well. So loads of examples from different departments, including MHC&LG, of requests for standards, review of existing standards, and Debbie's been working on one of those. But more recently, the competence standards framework is an example where MHC&LG has sponsored the transition of the competence work into a BSI stakeholder committee. So it will work, in my view, will work very, very smoothly because we have a very strong relationship with MHC&LG. We are appointed as the national standards body, so I would expect to have conversations about the need for standards. Wherever that direction came from, it might come from the regulators' new committee or other committees. It might come from anywhere, actually. And then we will pick it up and feed it into the system. And as Peter, when he introduced himself, described his role as chair of CB-DASHT. CB-DASHT is the top-level strategic committee for overseeing the whole portfolio of standards that relate to the built environment. So we're very fortunate to have that kind of expertise.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mary. Moving on now to product testing. Bob Blackman. Bob.
Thank you, Clive, and thank you for allowing me to ask these questions. In relation to product testing, I just want to move on to the testing regime. The independent review concluded that the product testing, labelling and marketing regime is opaque and insufficient, I quote, and called for a more effective testing regime. To what extent do you as panellists consider that the bill addresses these particular concerns? Don't know who wants to go first. Can I start? No desire by the sound of it. Debbie, do you want to go first with that particular issue?
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the testing regime that we currently have, we would agree that there is a lot that could be improved around that testing regime. The main reasons being that a manufacturer can turn up at a laboratory with a sample, have it tested, disappear, and there's no ongoing relationship with the test laboratory or whatever, and it's entirely up to the manufacturer what they do with the test report that they receive and how long they would continue to basically market product on the back of that. Now, one way to improve that, and one thing that was explored at length, and I think there was a general consensus in one of the working groups on the Hackitt review, and I in fact chaired that working group, was one way to resolve this and to provide greater transparency and clarity around this whole issue would be to mandate third-party certification of products. If you mandate third-party certification of products, it addresses a whole raft of the issues that are actually mentioned in the Building Safety Bill to do with publication of results, standardised presentation of the data, ongoing surveillance of the products, what you do if then a product is found to fail during the course of an audit test, what you do about product recall, rectification, so on and so forth. So all of those factors are elements that sit within standard certification type schemes. So one way to resolve this would be, as I say, to mandate a national level third-party certification scheme, which then certification bodies could offer to customers and so on as they require, and it would then, I say, solve a lot of those issues and that currently exist, and would help as well in contributing, because part of that you would check the marketing claims, you could check the literature, and it would all then feed into the golden thread and the trail, the auditable trail of what you have in a building where and what it achieved, and how it is performing and how it would be expected to perform. So that's my view on that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Peter, do you want to?
By all means, yes. Sorry, no reticence. I think we've been too polite, actually. I think there is a need to get a grip with product testing, without a doubt. I think in many areas, in many pockets, it's really good. And as Debbie has said, we have very good systems, but clearly that's not across the industry. And so again, I would hope that we can come out of this whole process with some consistency and with obvious objectives. I think I'd put it like that, to make sure that things are done properly. I think in addressing the issue that Dame Judith highlighted about product information, the CPA have been working hard to produce a code that we hope will be launching at the end of the year, and that code will basically be a declaration by all product providers who come onto the market with a product that their literature, their information, their website, even their representatives are actually speaking about things that are provable, that are reliable, that are focused. And we hope that's going to give things an entirely new approach in terms of making sure that customers, clients, everybody involved can understand what a product is meant to do and can effectively have confidence that it will deliver the performance that it is supposed to.
One of the criticisms that's made, of course, is that the tests themselves are not the right tests. And it appears, I think there would be a consensus amongst the committee here, there is a concern that the testing regime itself is not fit for purpose. Do you have any concerns about the testing regime itself and using the bill as a means to deliver that?
Yeah, I think there are concerns, because at the moment there isn't consistency. I'd come back to the point that some tests have been around the industry for a very long time. Some tests need updating, and some procedures need updating. So you look at the whole marketplace, and you can say absolutely we need to do more work in this area. But again, I don't think we want to necessarily throw away the whole system. Coming back to, does the bill actually deliver on this point? I think it's a case of, we can see that the basic structure is there, and will the secondary legislation actually deliver the things that I think we'd all agree we need.
One of the other issues, which I think is highlighted, is the fact that the results of the tests are not published. So we are reliant on companies saying, yes, it's passed the test and meets the requirements. Should we not see the results of these tests published so that everyone can compare what's gone on?
I think that is quite a challenge, because some of those test results are clearly have commercial value to them, and therefore that is a problem. It's a problem across the whole of industry. But absolutely, we should have test results that are consistent, clear, and that's part of the process that we've been working on to bring that to everybody's attention on a level playing field basis. Another element to this, though, is everybody converting to digital information, and I think that is really something that a lot of us are very passionate about, very keen on doing, and certainly we've been driving some of that as well. Getting consistent information expressed in the same way on a digital platform will undoubtedly help the industry, and other parts of the building safety programme I know are working hard at that. And of course, that's wrapped up in the concept of the golden thread as well.
Okay, we're going to come on to that in a minute. Scott, do you have any views?
Well, yes, because I mean, what you're discussing is demonstration of regulatory conformity. So, does the product meet the regulatory requirement? And the role of standards here is to provide the agreed test methods by which that is demonstrated or not. And the system we have today, you're balancing off the concept of innovation and innovative products with regulating absolutely everything. So saying you're going to regulate for the performance of every single product. So of course in the UK the system we have is a risk-based process, and we talked earlier about safety critical products. So when you're in this real realm of a safety critical product, then you would say yes, there needs to be a test done, and then the standard will define how the test should be done. The main problem I think that Debbie was hinting at is people not doing the tests at all. It's not that the standards are bad test methods, it's just that the people don't do the testing. It costs money and they're not required to do it. So the issue here is a cultural issue as much as a test regime issue. So in the post-transition we will have this similar process where we will have marking and presumption of conformity granted by the use of standards. But I would encourage more testing to take place and to be required to take place on higher risk buildings. I mean, that's very clear. If you do the tests, you will discover more things. If you have manufacturers who are deliberately trying to cheat the system, then that's an enforcement issue. But it's not to say that the standard of testing is inadequate. The test is there to demonstrate that the product meets the regulatory requirement. And as Dame Judith pointed out, we must stick with performance-based requirements.
Right. So actually, you're almost, not quite, but almost turning on its head to say, well, it's not the testing regime; it's the fact that people don't use the testing regime in the way that it was intended.
Yeah. So Debbie gave an example of that. She gave an example of a manufacturer turning up with getting one product tested, and then carries on, and who knows what they make downstream. So there's a whole enforcement side to that, which is really important, and we see that problem all over the world. I mean, it's not a UK problem that people try to get a certificate for their product and then they sell something else. So it's very difficult. You can't test every brick that's going to go into a building or every piece of rebar. So there has to be some cultural process by which inspection takes place. There's random testing, but there's penalties for people who actually are manipulating the agreed system.
But clearly, obviously we are talking here about fire safety testing. So if someone is saying this particular product will resist fire for a given period of time, if it's subjected to testing and that testing works, then they can say, well, it's 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever it may be. But if it doesn't do that in situ, then clearly that's a failure of the product. I mean, am I right in that?
Well, not necessarily, because you're back to this problem of the system, and whether that product was part of an overall system, or the test for the product was the product, and then the product is built into a system. The system as a whole fails. Was there a test method for that whole system? And the answer may be no, and then there should be a test method for that whole system, and it should be required to be used.
So there should be a test method, not necessarily for the product, but the system in which it's used.
Yes, and BRE.
There's a lot of criticism on that.
Yeah, BRE have a very big facility, for full-scale testing, which is rarely used because it costs money, but the benefit would be huge.
Okay. So I think Peter, you were trying to get in there.
Bob, thank you very much. Yes, I just wanted to unfortunately add to the complexity to say, and it is workmanship as well that obviously has some impact. I mean, I'm sure we've all heard reports of these things called cavity barriers, where walls have been opened up during the remediation and they've been put in upside down or back to front. So again, there is. I'm not trying to get away from the issue of absolutely products need to be of the appropriate quality, and the UK product industry, I've got to say, produces some really good top-notch products, but you have got to have this check and balance at every point in the process, and that, I think, is what we would hope the new legislation gives us.
Okay. Final thoughts from me. The government have said they're going to set up a construction products standards committee that will look at weaknesses within the regime. What powers do you think that committee needs to have?
Would you like me to lead off?
Go on. Yeah, kick off.
Yeah. So I'd say that committee, and we've had discussions with officials on this, and I'm very grateful for the bits we've been allowed to have with. But I do think that committee needs to have a clear understanding of the practicalities of construction, but it does need to be able to cover all products, because my concern is, while we are quite rightly focused on fire and structure as our initial targets, there are many other elements of a building that can cause risk and danger to people. And so I wouldn't want that committee to be limited in its consideration. I would also like it to have direct access to the regulator, but I'd also like it to have access to people who really understand the practicalities of construction and really understand the pressures and problems of how we try to resolve things in the built environment as well.
Okay, thank you. Debbie, did you want to make any final comments before we move on?
I think the remit for that group does need to be very clear. It needs to be clarified. At the moment, it isn't clear. I think it's quite opaque as to exactly what they are going to do and what their responsibilities will be. Because at the end of the day, the industry and the product manufacturers, etc., have all, and the standards makers, have got to have confidence in the credibility of that group if the system is going to work. And I say, at the moment, for me, there's not. Yeah. Sorry.
Do you think the bill should be amended accordingly? Because that's obviously one of the things that we as a committee are looking at. Okay, fine, thank you.
Yes, I do. I think that needs to be clarified.
Okay, that's very helpful.
Just a quick one to support that, but to say that the committee really needs to be very clearly focused on the regulatory requirement. And then Judith was very clear about performance-based regulatory requirements against which innovation is allowed to take place.
Yeah.
So these are the regulatory requirements we're talking about.
Yes, absolutely. All right, okay. Thank you very much. Clive.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I'm just getting a bit conscious of the time. I know there are challenging and detailed points we need to explore. But if there's an agreement between the three of you that something's been said already, you're happy with them. If we could just take it as read and try and move on to get all the subjects covered. Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll be as quick as I can. Good afternoon, everyone. The bill requires the regulator to establish various advisory committees. A question for all of you firstly, how effective do you think the Industry Competence Committee will be in addressing the issues of the past? Who wants to go first? Peter? Or Scott, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Steve.
I'll leap in because I was heavily involved with the Competence Steering Group and now, of course, the BECS, the Built Environment Competence Committee that we have in BSI to lead that work program. So there's a relationship between the Competence Standards Committee in BSI that will be overseeing the framework standards for competence and the Industry Competence Committee, which I see as actually a very useful committee to try and bring together the representatives from the regulator with industry, with residents, and provide that feet to the fire, keep the pressure on the industry to transform its training and development process. So there's a kind of keep the pressure on, and I think that committee would work very well. Whether it's needed forever, I don't know, but I think there needs to be some forum where we can bring together industry, regulator, and manufacturers to try and discuss how competence is being delivered in practice.
Thank you. And Peter?
I'd go along with Scott's comments entirely there. I think the main issue is rooting the committee in practicality. And I'll keep it brief. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Smith?
For brevity, I agree. Yeah, that competency is an absolute key element in all of this, and what's been said is I agree entirely.
Thank you very much. This is going very well. I just want to just draw your attention to one area, and my question is that, as you know, the regulator could give the committee further functions than those in the draft bill that we've seen. You've mentioned, particularly Dr. Smith, about competence, but should it have functions in relation to training and or standards? You want to go on?
What I'm hoping is that the Competence Committee will help to provide input to the Standards Committee itself. So the Standards Committee has to be independent and neutral and stakeholder-led, but it would take input from the Competence Committee to say, oh, we've found this problem, or this group isn't improving their competence fast enough. What can we do from the standards dimension to support that? And on the other side, they can support the accreditation process. Really important that there's independent third-party accreditation of the industry schemes that the various associations and professional bodies are developing or improving, shall we say. So they sit in the middle of that process. I don't think they should take on more work themselves, other than a scrutiny and power to keep the pressure on the sector, the associations, the professional bodies, and indeed input to the BSI standards people who will work on the standards itself.
Thank you. And Peter, you want to say something? Sorry.
I would, yes, if you don't mind. Thanks for it. So many times in construction, we start off with good intentions, and dare I say it, commerciality takes a hold, and we see industries springing up to support the industries that support the industries. So many third parties, so many different elements which actually contribute very little and yet suck resource and energy out of the industry. And I'd be very keen in this new structure, this new regime we're trying to create, that we, as much as possible, guard against that and try and focus on one-to-one relationships, on making sure that when we say somebody needs to prove they're competent, they can do it in a one-to-one relationship. They don't need to go to a third party and a third party, etc. I hope that makes the point.
Thank you. Anything to add, Dr. Smith?
Obviously the implementation of the competency framework and so on will be dependent upon the training and the consistency of that training in order to improve the quality of construction and the installation, etc., that we see on site. So I think there's a whole raft, and that there'll be a mix of things that are required. But what I don't think would be great would be for the committee itself to become involved in that training. I mean, third parties will become involved in that, and some of it will be vocational training, some of it will be improvements in professional qualifications and professional training. So it'll be throughout the industry, and I think the industry needs to be allowed with the educational framework to develop the training that is required to address these issues.
Thank you very much. And Scott, you mentioned in relation to where you think that the regulators shouldn't necessarily have some responsibilities and shouldn't necessarily interfere into the competence committee. As you know, the regulator itself must provide such assistance and encouragement as it considers appropriate to facilitate those in the built environment industry improving their competence. And it may be that you just want to provide a short answer to this, but the bill explanatory notes give examples of this working through the competence committee. What else could or should the regulator do, or is your previous answer enough on this subject?
I think it's probably enough on this subject. There are over 120 organisations in the sector who have training and competence schemes. They need to be independently accredited to meet the requirements of the bill. And I think that the regulator can oversee this, but to get involved in any detail is very difficult indeed.
Thank you. And excuse the sirens, I'm in the middle of London in my office, so if that interferes, I apologise. A question for all of you. Clause 12 of the bill allows the Secretary of State to repeal all 3 committees by regulations, not even requiring any kind of consultation at all. Is there a situation in which a theoretical situation in which you think that could be justified? That's a question for all 3 of you. Do you want to go first, Peter, and then Scott, or then Debbie, then Scott?
I am struggling to see where that would occur, to be honest with you. And so, for the sake of brevity, I'll say I can't conceive that there would be a situation.
Thank you. And Debbie?
Yeah, I'm struggling as well. To be honest, I can't think of a situation where that would occur.
Thank you. And Scott?
Sorry.
Yeah, we will always need a building advisory committee, and we should have a resident panel, and we should have an industry competence committee. I can't see a situation where you remove them all.
Thank you, and don't apologise, Debbie. That's what you're here for. If you don't think there is one, then we'll include that in our final report. And finally, from me, just one question to Peter. The bill abolishes the Building Regulations Advisory Committee and replaces it with the Buildings Advisory Committee. Given your recent experience on the BRAC, do you have any thoughts on this change?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do, Paul. Because the current committee has been very much, whilst it's a ministerial appointment for people, it's been very much arm's length, and it's very much a case of a critical friend. But there have been lots of discussions within that committee, I think, that have been incredibly valuable and incredibly powerful, but unfortunately have not seen the light of day. I would like to see a new committee that is very much more independent, very much more able to make suggestions that, if you like, are taken on board. And so therefore I'd like to see a much more robust structure, something that actually does contribute to the situation. After all, the people around that table have a vast amount of experience, a vast amount of knowledge, and it should be taken account of and used directly in making everything better for everybody.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Paul. Moving on now to an issue which certainly Dame Judith highlighted in her report, accountability. Bob Blackman, you have some questions on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. As Clive says, this is a key part of not only the report from Dame Judith Hackitt, but the actual legislation itself. And it obviously sets out proposals for duty holders to have formal responsibilities for compliance with building regs. And it's based on the main duty holder roles under the construction regulations. Is there a direct read across to the roles, particularly that of principal designer under CDM 2015? I don't know who wants to kick off on that.
I'll try.
Yeah, go on, Scott.
First, Paul. There is a read across. When we discussed the terminology here, it's very important that we don't just keep inventing new roles and new titles. Yeah. So the concept here of a higher risk building or asset, maybe in the future, And there will be a principal designer, and that principal designer in the higher risk project needs to have additional competence. The competence we've talked about already this afternoon around systems and all of that thing, not just their technical competence, but their soft skills. We've seen that in the oil and gas industry. They've learned how to do that, but they haven't yet taken it on in the built environment. So the ambition here was that there is, of course, a CDM question, but we have to go beyond that, but we don't want to create another role. So I was supportive of the idea of principal designer having to demonstrate additional competencies that related to this issue of major incidents, preventing the occurrence or controlling the impact of major incidents in the future or over the long term. So I think that there is a read across, but it's a different set of skills.
Okay, so what framework should you apply to ensure we get consistency right across the competencies?
Well, the competence framework standard is in motion now. That's the project that's underway. The new British standard will be supported by 3 PAS standards, and 1 for principal designer, 1 for principal contractor, 1 for building safety manager. That work is underway right now. In fact, we've already published the first edition. It's called a BSI Flex on overarching competence. So the group that has come together to discuss and agree what that looks like, when they get on to principal designer, they will be looking across to make sure that competencies don't overlap with the issues with CDM. But the requirements that they're looking for here, as I say, are very much to do with a different skill set from CDM. This is not about safety on site. This is about safety of the finished product in use. So it's that kind of looking ahead. So the skill set I'm anticipating they will be looking for in competence is much more around risk and systems thinking and long-term risk and how to identify whether things are being designed properly rather than a CDM perspective.
Okay, clearly the regulator's got a key role in this, driving up levels of competence.
Yes, and we're discussing with HSE right now, actually, that interface, and HSE, of course, is heavily involved in the standards development process. So that relationship is being worked out right now. So BSI working with HSE.
Okay, so what else should the regulator do? I mean, given your experience so far, what else is required?
The regulator needs to be clear how they're going to regulate, how they're going to enforce on the ground these requirements. And until we really know that, then it's hard to finish the standards on competence in order to make sure there's a proper handshake in the middle.
Okay. Peter, do you have any views?
I absolutely do, Bob. Thank you. I think there is an important read across in the roles insofar as we've had the principal designer, principal contractor role now since 2015. It has taken an awful long time to embed that thinking into the industry. And in fact, I've got to say, some parts of the industry are still trying to reverse that decision. They'd like to hark back to previous eras, I think. But also there are lots of pockets within the industry that still don't quite get it. They still don't quite understand what those roles are all about, which I think is a great shame. But nonetheless, we've got a bit of heritage, a bit of momentum there. So in order to take this forward, as Scott said, expand it and develop it, I think is so important. I think the challenge for the regulator is to actually understand how this works. Again, I'll come back to it at grassroots level, because people will take on the role and have different approaches, different attitudes, and I think it's so important that the regulator maps out exactly what is required of them, but in very straightforward terms. And I think that will then see us have some success.
Okay, Debbie, I understand part of your role is to collaborate with the University of Edinburgh to create the next generation of safety experts. Do you think there's a capacity of individuals to undertake the various different roles, duties and responsibilities that are required in the bill, given the type of onerous responsibilities that are going to be expected?
As things stand right now, I think there is a skills shortage and there's a gap between, who we have available to us and the rate at which we are producing people with the right qualifications to fulfill all of these roles. But given all of the work that is going on, that's not to say that that won't be addressed. As long as we can make it attractive enough for the young to wish to go into this profession. And that's key, isn't it? That there's a desire and willingness of the young to join the construction sector, to join the fire safety engineering profession, and all of the other professions that are needed.
In your experience, how long is it going to take to get people up to the competence level that we're talking about to take on these roles?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a quick fix. It's not something that will happen overnight. As Scott explained, the standards are in their development now. They in themselves will take time. You've then got to be able to respond to that framework of standards. And, it's going to take, even taking people through qualifications in university, you're talking about a 3 to 4 year time frame.
And presumably you've got to have someone
so in the meantime
to train and assess people to get them through university courses as well. Okay.
Yes.
So we are talking about years. We're not talking about months or weeks. It's quite clearly something that's going to take
absolutely
some time.
Not in my view anyway.
Okay. Finally, from me, sorry, so did someone else?
Sorry, Jem, Bob, may I just make a point on this?
Yes.
Because we must avoid confusing general training for young people and people moving in and the key regulated roles you're talking about. The people who are going to take on those regulated roles are going to be senior professionals today. There'll be board directors, there'll be senior managers in companies today, already very well qualified and deeply experienced. What we're talking about is adding a layer of competence to these people. And we've been through this once before. The COSH model is an interesting model, and it already exists in the chemical industry and oil and gas. So read across, actually, there's a much closer read across from these regulated roles to oil and gas than there is to CDM. And if we think it's an enhanced CDM role, we've got the wrong end of the stick. This is about the prevention of major disasters. And so the lessons of skills and training from that sector are a direct read across to what we need to do right now. And yes, it'll take some time and it's a matter of a few years, but at the beginning, we don't need that many of these people. I mean, there's a huge demand for every building in the end, but building safety managers will take on a portfolio of buildings, principal designers and principal contractors. You'll have a few of them in your company and they'll support the project. So we need to ramp up and there'll be a transition period, 10 years, but the training of the competence for the regulated roles is completely different to the entry level.
Yeah, there has been concern about who are the people that are going to take on these roles, given the onerous duties that apply and potential criminal sanctions if things go wrong. So
but it's time. It really is time that we had regulated roles where the public risk is so high, and it's time.
Could I just ask you then, Scott, finally, and others can comment afterwards. Some people have suggested we need a registration scheme for individuals acting as duty holders. Do you support that principle?
Yes, I am keen that people who are qualified to take on these onerous roles are likely to have to, potentially to re-qualify every couple of years, frankly. Yeah. And there may be some thousands of them, but they're not going to be hundreds of thousands of them. They're going to be thousands or tens of thousands of them. So yes, I think that there should be a registration scheme, and that may be held by the regulator for these individuals. But that's not for everybody in the industry. That's just for the regulated.
For the main, the regulated roles. Okay.
And that would be maybe part of their career development.
Okay. Peter and Debbie, any further comments on that particular issue?
I was just going to say that I think this is also though going to develop some drive across the industry. So where we create higher profile, higher duty roles, I think that will drag parts of the industry into that higher aspirational position, and thereby create the momentum for the cultural change that we all are seeking. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Right, just moving on now to the final two question areas. Again, conscious of time, if we can deal with these succinctly. Accountability gateways, Mohammed Yassin.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bill provides powers for gateway procedures to be brought in through secondary legislation. So my question is for all of you. How would you like to see these gateways operate? So you can answer briefly if you can. I can start with Debbie Smith, please.
I mean, this is an area that is really outside of my competence, so perhaps I'll just defer to Scott and to Peter on this particular issue.
Scott?
I'm going to invite Peter to answer that one, if I may.
It's obviously a difficult question, this one.
It's going well, isn't it?
I'm thanking my fellow panellists very much. No, I think the gateway system is a sensible starting point. I think that having a clear structure like that, bringing it in with the bill, is the right approach. A couple of things I would pick out, though. At the moment, in the documentation, it says that Gateway 1 would be instigated prior to any professionals being engaged. I fail to see how that's going to happen, in that Gateway 1 effectively requires you to have a planning set of documents, a fire assessment at that stage, as I understand it. That needs to be done by a professional. It needs to be done properly, and somehow it goes against what we've just been talking about in terms of quality, professionalism and responsibility. Secondly, I think we need to have a clear understanding of what procedures are required at each of the gateways, and I think we also need to have a clear understanding that all of these processes should be done in a digital format, for the sake of clarity, for the sake of robustness going forward. So I hope that gets me to more or less answering your question.
Thank you for that. Peter, Gateway 1 happens before duty holders are appointed. Is that a problem, and why?
Yes. Yeah, it's a problem because the information that we have so far says that you need to provide details of the actual scheme. You need to provide a clear fire assessment, and in order to do that, you need to have professionals working on the project providing that information. Otherwise, there's a bit of a catch-22 here. You can't actually have the robustness, certainty, clarity that we are all seeing by this new process unless that is undertaken by people who understand the project and understand the job.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And move on to final questions now. Ian Levy.
Thank you, Chair. I'm conscious of time, so I'll try and be as brief as I can with this. And if I could direct this at Dr. Debbie Smith. The bill contains powers for the creation and maintenance of the so-called golden thread, the information throughout a building's life cycle. The notes say that the information will be held digitally. What are the challenges that you see to the successful implementation of these provisions?
Well, the consistent presentation of data is key to the digital representation of the golden thread. I mean, the golden thread is something that I know Peter Capelhorn is very, very involved in, and has
maybe I directed at the wrong person. Sorry.
So yeah, I mean, if Peter wanted to come in and take that one,
by all means.
I'm
very happy to delve.
Yes.
You know, the issue, Ian, to start off with, is that we have made great strides in providing digital information in construction, but it is not yet universal and it's not yet joined up. We need to ensure that the whole of the industry works to the same standards. Going back to Scott's point at the earlier part of this session, we have those standards. We're a world leader in those standards, but the UK construction industry needs to get a grip totally on all of those. to develop the basic data. We also have a problem that I'm particularly keen on, and that is making sure that the product data is universal and correctly expressed. And we don't currently have that, although the CPA have been working on a system called Lexicon for some time. We hope that will then crack this particular nut. Once we've got the right data, we then need to ensure that everybody along the way, so that's the client, the designers, the contractor, the supply chain, and indeed the building operators and actually the owners, all approach this particular information in the same way. But we have also got to make the system work for everybody. And I think there's a few challenges along the way on that score. And I would say that I don't think there is any country in the world yet that has got this completely cracked.
Yeah. May I add to that?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was actually with the foresight and encouragement of government some years ago that the UK took a leap, overtook other countries in the digitalisation of the sector through the building information modelling standards that Peter refers to. So it was the British standards that then became the ISO, the Internet, they're called 19650, that series. So the problem has been actually getting people to use it in the industry. And although it was driven through procurement on major projects, and industry leaders are way ahead of this, seeing it rolled into the wider community would be a fantastic goal. Then there's also amazing new work going on, for example, at the Centre for Digital Built Britain in Cambridge, and digital twins and the connecting of IoT to construction products and design. And so the future is there. We just have to pull it together. But I think that the standards development program in digital information is already in motion that can support this ambition.
Thank you. Peter's kind of touched on my next question to this, so I'll put this out to the team. What information do you think needs to be included, and who should have access to that information? I'm thinking of emergency services, county councils. You know, who do you think should actually have access to that digital information?
Well, I'll go first, Peter, but it's a very serious question because of security. So there have been big concerns about how far in the supply chain and in the blue lights and so on, who should have access to all that information? Do you know precisely how to access that building? The specification of the doors, the security doors, the fire alarms, all of that. So you have to think very carefully about how you can segment the data to make sure that only the people who really need to know have access to it. And it doesn't start turning up all over the world for people who have other intents to use that data to get into that building and to do damage to it. So that's my first question, but of course there has to be a way, and they may need to have education and training as well in how to use this digital information. Peter, do you have?
I was just going to thank you, Scott. I was just going to say that what information needs to be contained, I think we have a fairly good grip on. I think that was spelt out in Dame Judith's report. But clearly, all the basic information about the geometric characteristics, but also about the performance of the building, but also about the products that actually are contained within the building, so that future analysis or maintenance can be dealt with properly. We know with sad events such as Lakenhall House a few years ago that maintenance is a significant issue with regard to people's safety. So the golden thread should be delivering that output for everybody as well. In terms of who gets the information, Scott's hit the nail on the head. Security is crucial, but clearly those in charge of the building, those responsible for people's safety, need to have primary access. And a few years ago, I painted a picture for fire chiefs that they should have digital information projected on the inside of helmets, for instance, when they go into a fire to find their way around. And that is achievable. In fact, it's being worked on right now. Those are the goals, but making sure that we have security protocols in this information is crucial to making sure that it only is used for good.
Yeah. And the other biggest problem here is the legacy of old building stock. I mean, this is a very, very long-term problem. So whilst you can conceive of a system that will work well for new build, or even for refurbished parts of an existing building. If you go into anywhere in the built environment, do you believe what you see on the old piece of paper? Would you ever believe it? Is there ever enough information? So you could be talking about a life cycle of 50 years, 80 years, before you actually had enough of the national building stock fully digitized to believe it. So it's very urgent, but it's a very big problem, and we shouldn't mislead ourselves to think a silver bullet to this problem.
Yeah, thank you for your answers there. And over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ian. And thank you to all our witnesses for giving evidence this afternoon. It's been very detailed, but very professional and very helpful to the committee in getting our understanding of the draft legislation improved. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
And we're now moving on to our second panel of witnesses. And I'll just go around the three witnesses we have in order and ask them just to introduce themselves. First of all, Lord Gary Porter. Gary.
Hi, Chairman. I'm the Local Government Association Building Safety Spokesman, also leader of a council in Lincolnshire. And I used to sit in the House of Lords when we were allowed in.
Thank you, Gary. Steve Wood? Sorry, I think you're muted, Steve. We can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Apologies, rookie error. Steve Wood, NHBC. We're home warranty provider, about 50% of the 75 to 80% of the market, 1.5 million homes under cover. NHBC is non-profit distributing with no shareholders. We've got about 600 building inspectors, engineers and surveyors helping improve quality in new homes in the UK. And of course, we're also a building control body. As an approved inspector providing building control around 50 to 55% of new homes in the UK, which represents around 50% of the approved inspector capacity in the market.
Thank you for that. Lorna Stimpson.
Hi, my name's Lorna Stimpson. I worked in public service building control for 21 years before moving to LABC. Just a bit of background on LABC. It's the membership organisation for public service building control in England and Wales. And our primary functions are in-depth technical policy and coordination for our 3,800 surveyors, externally accredited learning and qualifications for the surveying network, and also UCAS accredited competency validation assessments, standards and performance. I've worked for LABC for 12 years. I'm the Chief Executive, and amongst other committees, I'm a member of BRAC and the Joint Regulators Group Board. Thank you
to all three of you for that introduction. Right, so the first question, and I'll indicate the order of the witnesses to answer the question, if that's okay, and the same with future questioners. If you agree with what's been said, just saying you agree helps with the time issues, but there will be time to hopefully get through all the matters we want to consider with you. First of all, the intention of the bill is to implement the recommendations from Dame Judith Hackitt's review to, in the end, prevent another Grenfell from happening. Look, Porter, do you think the bill actually does that in terms of an overall look at it?
I think it will go a long way towards that, but I don't think any of us believe it's ever going to be possible to prevent serious issues like Grenfell just by merely changing the legislation that surrounds it. But the bill certainly will go a long way towards it. There are a number of issues with the bill that seem to fight against its intention, though. So as you ask the questions, I'll be more than happy to explore some of those.
Okay. Steve Wood?
Yes, I mean, we certainly support the principles behind the bill, and it does align with Dame Judith Hackitt's review. In particular, the establishment of a single building safety regulator across public and private sector is a very good move. And the need for greater accountability through design, build, maintenance and handover is essential. And we additionally support the appointment of a new homes ombudsman, which will help the drive to improve quality and safety. And there are definitely the right intent around improved controls on existing high-rise buildings and product testing regimes. But I think there's a lot of detail to work through to make sure that comes in practice, and we do have areas of concern which I'm happy to elaborate on.
Okay, and over to Lorna Stimpson.
Yeah, we very much welcome the draft bill. We've been part of the Joint Regulators Group and other committees in creating what has been presented so far. And so, yes, very, very supportive. Think that it does do what Dame Judith wanted it to do. It's a holistic, it's a whole building system, and we very much appreciate that. Not wanting to be negative at all, but there is a but. I am concerned, we are concerned that we are creating a two-tier system, and we are going to have a gold-plated system for what is a relatively small number of buildings. I think about 12,500 higher risk buildings in England at the moment, average around 880, I think it's been suggested, refurbishment and new build projects per year, which is a very, very small amount of overall construction industry projects. And so, I would just like to see a personal plea to actually see the robustness regime to be extended more widely than is currently suggested, and I think that there are various ways that could happen, and certainly ways that could happen without overwhelming the building safety regulator, who obviously is going to have a period of transition, and certainly ways that could happen without overwhelming the building safety regulator, who obviously is going to have a period of transition, encourage a widening of this regime if possible.
Right, so you're arguing that right from the very beginning we should have a higher number of buildings covered then, not just a certain number of very high rise buildings.
I think that the difficulty we have is defining that new regime and the scope of that regime. I think we've struggled over the last few years, haven't we, the whole of industry,
yes.
And looking at...
What would you like it to be then?
I would like the gateway approach, should I say, the gateway approach, whilst not having to incumbent the building safety regulator could be widened across the whole building control industry, so that people had to wait for some form of permission before they started work and some form of permission before they occupy buildings. I think that would be a very good way of tightening a regime that wouldn't have to necessarily involve the building safety regulator. But obviously we could spend another hour talking about that, and I don't want to take up all of your...
I think Lord Porter, you've been fairly vociferous about this definition of what buildings should be covered, so do you want to tell us your views on it?
Yeah, I mean, just high-rise stuff over 18 metres, it's just that's not going in the right direction at all. We need to look at the risk presented to the people occupying each building. I mean, you could live in theory, you could live in a 5-storey block of flats with one fire escape and no automatic suppression system and not be covered, and yet live in a 6-storey block of flats with 3 fire escapes and automatic suppression system and spend time being covered by that. It needs to be on risk. We've seen recently care homes where people have difficulty getting out of the building, they're not going to be covered. For us, it's more important that you look at the vulnerability of the people in the building and the building's ability to keep people safe, and regulation shouldn't just be on height alone.
Steve Wood?
Yeah, I agree with that last answer. I mean, I think the height of the building is a proxy for risk, and it should be risk that really drives it, and that's some of the detail that does need to be worked through. Also, I think it was set in part because of the concerns about capacity and competence in the market, and that's an area which we would have concerns about in terms of how the building safety regulator would appoint an inspector around. We don't agree that it should be a default to local authority. The default should be to the most competent provider, but that's perhaps a separate topic.
Well, we'll come on to the issue of building control, I think, in a minute. So, just pursuing 2 other issues about the maybe some conflicts between this legislation and other government policy announcements around the planning white paper, the extension of permitted development rights in particular, which sort of relax controls over buildings. Have you got concerns about those conflicts, Gary Porter?
Yeah, certainly. The Gateway 1 principle is out of the window if the planning white paper gets assent. If that goes through as a bill, people won't come to councils anymore to talk through initial drafts of what they're proposing to do. And you've already said for permitted development rights, that will get people away. That somebody needs to sit down and look, these two pieces of legislation don't work together. So either the planning white paper will need to be changed, or Gateway 1 on this will need to be scrapped as a gateway.
Okay, any points there you want to pick up on, the witnesses?
I would just echo Lord Porter. You know, from our perspective, the case for safety has to start at the very, very earliest concept of a design. If that case for safety is only going to be starting at around the building regulation submission stage, it's far too late. You know, it needs to be considered very, very early on, and so it shouldn't be an add-on that's considered, you know, months, years down the line.
Yeah, I agree with the previous speakers. I've got nothing to add. Thank you.
Finally, from me, one of the things that's certainly been raised with the committee, and I think raised widely outside the committee as well, is the concerns about costs falling on leaseholders for remediation work on existing buildings. And there are possibilities arising from this bill that additional charges specifically related to building safety could be levied on leaseholders. Now, the government say that they are working to deal with those issues, but as it stands, the legislation doesn't really provide an escape from leaseholders to those potential charges. Do you think this is a problem in the bill that really needs addressing? Would you like to come in on that? Yes, Gary.
Well, they certainly are going to have to, government certainly are going to have to be cognizant of the costs to leaseholders. It can't be considered fair, can it? If you bought a property in good faith, your lawyers have checked it out, building control have signed it off, all the products have got the right certificates, and you end up in a building that you can't sleep safe in at night, and then you also have to pay extra money to try and make it safe. That can't be right. And I am a big fan of the taxpayer not paying hand over fist for everything, but I think in the case of the retrospective work that's going to be needed, I think the taxpayer is probably going to have to pick up the bill in the short term, but the government must pursue through the legal system, through courts, anybody who's really at fault for having buildings that are, well, I wouldn't say deliberately unsafe, but appear to be deliberately unsafe, where corners have been cut, where products have been gained through the testing system. That in those cases, those companies should be bankrupted, not the individual people living in the properties that they've sold them.
Okay. Lorna, Steve, do you want to comment?
I don't have anything worthwhile to add to. I completely agree with Lord Porter. Nothing to add.
Okay. Steve?
I would just add that when we have paid out warranty claims in this area and validated around 20 claims on major projects with a value of about £100 million. So we meet our obligations to our policyholders, but the bulk of the remediation costs are still there and not necessarily got warranty insurance in place. So I do agree with the essence of Lord Porter's response, and that the taxpayer is going to have to contribute, but the government should follow any recovery rights it can.
Okay. Thank you very much for those answers. Moving on now to Ian Byrne. Ian.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks, Lord Porter, for that excellent contribution for the last question. I thought it was extremely refreshing to hear them comments. So I'll direct this to Lorna. Clause 48 of the bill amends legislation to remove the ability for persons carrying out any building work for or on higher risk buildings to choose their own building control body. Should this prohibition be extended to all buildings? And it's been called for by Wool within the submission, and I think we covered it before, but I'm really interested to get it on record, your views, Lorna.
Yes. I think the draft bill and the suggestion of the removal of duty holder choice will work on in-scope buildings most without doubt. I think, as I said before, in-scope buildings make up a very small percentage of construction work every year, and I'm afraid that competition and choice of regulator will remain for the other 95% of building projects that occur. I'm afraid to say that in the past 35 years, it has shown that there is a natural economic result of competition, and a regulatory function means that some people will seek the least intervention at the least price. I'm afraid that is a fact that Dame Judith came to in her recommendations. It concerns me because I think that whilst the stronger sanctions are welcome, it might be an unintended consequence would be to push developers who prefer lighter touch on out-of-scope buildings away from local authorities in the future. That will have implications of its own. So naturally, I would imagine that you think that from a local authority building control perspective, and that's what I'm here for today, I do think that there shouldn't be a choice of regulator. That doesn't infer any negativity about my colleagues in private sector building control. We are a profession. We're a profession that is coming together increasingly. But I do believe that the construction industry as a whole has dictated to us over the last 30 odd years just how much regulation they're prepared to pay for, and we have become a commodity, and that cannot continue. We are providing inspection regimes based on how much they're prepared to pay us to do that inspection, and that can't be right when it comes to regulation.
And just to build on just a point you made, so if the prohibition was extended to all buildings, would the industry be able to cope with that from the outset, or would it have to be built in gradually? And is there any concerns about the actual funding of the BSR with regards to being linked into the HSA, which has obviously seen really severe cuts over the last decade?
You've asked me about 5 questions there, so I'll try to remember. The first one was about capacity in the industry. I think I've got 2 answers for you, which is not going to be very helpful. The first answer is there are lots of building control surveyors out there, and we're handling the work that exists at the moment. And so, if regulatory choice was taken out of the equation, our approved inspector colleagues or professionals who work for private companies could always come back and work for local authorities, but I'm not sure that we can afford them. But anyway, so that's one answer. The other part of that answer, so answer 1B, is that the amount of surveyors in our industry is very much determined by the amount of inspection and intervention that we've been allowed to give the industry over the last 30 odd years. And as I said before, it hasn't been enough. It needs to be far more. So by that same rule, we need far more people to be able to do the job properly. So the answer is yes, but no. Sorry, that's not a very good answer. And I have no clue what your other questions were because I've forgotten. I'm sorry. Please.
I have that ability. I'll move on to, does Lord Porter or Steve want to add anything on them questions?
You probably wouldn't expect me to say this, but I'm not afraid of our building inspectors competing with the private sector. In fact, probably because we would get all of the high-risk buildings under this, it's probably more damaging to LABC because there's a good chance that we'll get all the expensive work and the private sector will pick up all the cheap-to-do work. So I'm not sure that just a simple ban in 18 metres and above from approved inspectors is the right way of going about it. And in terms of what they're inspecting, I think successive governments over the years have deregulated the level of inspection that's necessary to provide for safe buildings. And I think that's where the real problem is. It isn't whether somebody's working for the private sector or for the state sector in checking things, it's the amount of stages that need checking that should be increased and not decreased as it has been. So I think the standard needs to be improved, an inspection regime needs to be improved, not necessarily whether somebody's on a private sector books or on the state books. But
Steve?
Yes, if I can make a couple of points, Ian. First of all, we've got no problem if the duty holder doesn't appoint the building control body. But the choice shouldn't be between public or private. It should be based on competence. I'd make a point about approved inspectors, just in case there's confusion. Approved inspectors are not regulators. We're regulated by SICAR, the Construction Industry Council Approved Inspection Register. We're licensed and audited. But I'm going to speak for NHBC rather than approved inspectors. And because we're an insurance company as well, there's a very strong alignment with the objective of ensuring that the building is built to building standards, building regulations, because otherwise we pay for it as the warranty insurer. So that's a very strong commercial alignment. And also we have significant capacity in the market, and indeed a major projects team that focuses on the very properties that are subject to this bill.
Thanks, Steve. I'll just ask this one quickly. I can see the chair staring at me. It terrifies me. So I'll direct this one at Lord Porter. What could be the impact for local authorities on the proposal, both for in-scope and out-of-scope buildings?
Again, it's on that. It's on, if LABC are picking up the in-scope buildings, and they're going to be very expensive to look after, and the out-of-scope buildings, the private sector will be free to take all of the work. So we'll end up with us getting all of the hard-to-do, very difficult stuff, and probably not have as many qualified people to take that on as we need, and the private sector will be allowed to just cream off the good stuff again. Mainly that part of the competition, I think.
Okay. Lorna, Steve?
Yeah, if I may just comment there. A couple of things that I do want to point out there is we're already experiencing greater competition on out-of-scope buildings. So that competition has ramped up because people are voting with their feet and choosing to use non-local authority building control provision. Will that get worse with the sanctions and powers that local authorities are going to be expected to use by the building safety regulator? I'm not complaining. I'm a public service building control person at heart, and I've always wanted increased sanctions, but that doesn't tend to appeal to all of the contractors and developers and duty holders in the world. And if they've got a choice on out-of-scope buildings, I think that they will vote. As Lord Porter says, I think it will have a detriment on local authorities. And you can't forget that the very same experienced competent surveyors that are going to be looking after these most complex buildings are the same people who spend 30% of their time in local authorities looking after and keeping you and I safe. And by that I mean in the public protection work that they have to do as part of their role in local authorities in 24-hour call-out support for dangerous structures, safety at sports grounds works, demolitions, and so on and so forth. And so, there is a very real danger here that the pressure that is going to be put on out-of-scope buildings and the continuation of the choice of regulator will have a detrimental effect on local authorities in that 30% of their building control provision on pure public protection, which of course private sector building control don't have that response.
Thanks, Lorna. Steve, anything to add?
Only very briefly that whether it's in scope or out of scope, because we're an insurance company, our interests are aligned in ensuring quality and safety, and that's what our 600 or so building inspectors, engineers and surveyors are focused upon. So I don't see that as an issue for us as an organisation.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks. Just say Steve Wood. Okay, you may have a particular position in your organisation, but you think in principle it's right that a developer should be able to appoint their own building control inspector, with the perhaps not the unspoken indication that they get a hard time from the inspector, he won't get another job.
As I said, we've got no problem if they are not able to do that. And as an insurance company, our interests are aligned, because if they're not built to the right standard and to building regulations, we'll pay for it as a warranty provider down the line. So there's no problem with that, provided the right competence is being deployed in the building control function.
Right. I suppose I was asking a question that maybe for other developers, not quite in your position. But anyway, well, let's move on. Rachel Hopkins has got some further questions.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to explore the relationship between the regulator and local authorities. So it might be Lord Porter and Lorna who might have more to say on that. So the regulator will be establishing a unified building control profession and will have powers to bring in local authority experience, notable local authority building control teams, but will also hold to account building control bodies. So how do you see the relationship between the regulator and local authorities developing?
Obviously, we'd prefer to have the regulator sitting on an equal footing with local authorities and fire authorities, but at the moment, I mean, they've chosen not to do it that way around, so we've kind of had to work our way through with that. But at the moment, the working relationship's going really well. So the work that they are doing together, I think, does give me some confidence that the professionalism of all three sectors that will be involved with this will still provide for an agency that works well together and not in competition with itself. It wasn't our preferred choice, but I think as a sector, we're content with it. I think it's probably the best way of describing it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if I can just echo that, was it our preferred choice? I don't know, actually. I think when the idea of the HSE or somebody becoming a building safety regulator kind of came out of left field. But I think the more that we thought about it, you know, there is a need for a coordinating role. You know, the issues going back many years have been the Fire and Rescue Service have got responsibility for buildings once they're in occupation, and the building regulations and the Building Act as it stands at the moment don't give the opportunity for the Fire and Rescue Service to have their voices taken account of, although there is supposed to be, you know, a mutual working relationship, and that does happen. It doesn't happen. And so I think that there was always a need for a coordinating body. And I think that is, you know, as we started to understand what the role of the building safety regulator was going to be, I think that started to fall in very much into place. You know, I do think, you know, we are talking about at the moment fire and structural safety, and that's very high on our agenda. There are, as one of our previous speakers, I think it was Peter, said, you know, we do have to take account of all of the other building regulations and impacts on safety and well-being of people in buildings, and that is where building control surveyors will come into their own. So I think the coordination role is absolutely necessary. I think the building safety regulator, you know, they are the HSE as it is at the moment, you know, has an authority within the construction industry. And I think that is what's vitally needed. I think the authority of building control, of whatever flavour building control that is, you know, I think the authority that we've had over the last 30 odd years has been depleted, has disappeared, and you know, it needs to come back. And if that is, you know, by the HSE as the building safety regulator taking the lead, then absolutely yes, I think it's the right way forward. I think we're working at the moment. Lots of what is to come, you know, is about operational works, about how it's actually going to work in practice, you know, and we are working closely with the HSE and with HC&LG to work on those processes and procedures and how local authorities can best support the regulator going forward.
Thanks, Laura. I'm just going to push on that because you preempted my next sort of question in terms of, do you think local authorities and building control teams have the capacity at an organisational level to deliver the changes successfully and to take on the roles envisaged in the bill?
Yes, I do. I think at this moment in time, local authority building control, LABC, we have been working very hard over the last 3 years to start to prepare ourselves in anticipation of you know, the draft bill saying the things that it does today. And so we very much took on what Dame Judith said some years ago now, about competence and resilience and standards and performance. And so we now have a situation where all apart from 29 local authority teams within England and Wales are externally audited for performance and standards under a UCAS accreditation. And also we have now 550 of our most competent surveyors have gone through a process of becoming assessed and accredited to work on higher risk buildings. So we have 550 of those surveyors now who are accredited. That will be reinforced in the next few months by an ISO 17024 accreditation, which means that UCAS will be independently auditing how LABC accredits those surveyors to ensure that they do indeed know what they're doing and that they're competent to be able to do the work that the building safety regulator is going to expect of them. So very much a work in progress. We have another examination just next week, COVID secure examination, shall I say, but you know, where we're going to be putting another 100 surveyors through that assessment process. So we're building that competence all of the time. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I did a little bit of number crunching earlier, and just in Manchester alone, and I would say Manchester is my hometown, so of the 880 anticipated new and refurbishment projects a year, that works out at about 22 projects in Manchester on average. And we already have 9 competent surveyors in Manchester whose competency has been externally validated. So, you know, to give you a little bit of an idea of the resilience of local authority, yes, is the answer. We're doing everything we possibly can to be able to support the regulator going forward.
Thank you. And Lord Porter, anything to add to that?
Well, other than the need for full cost recovery for the work to be undertaken, clearly local authorities are already under immense revenue pressures, and additional work, whilst welcome from some of our professional members of staff, still need to be paid for, and I would like to see some sort of locally set fee charging regime. At the moment, there are a number of functions that come across to us, the latest one being licensing, alcohol licensing and stuff, where we still lose out because government nationally set the fees that we can charge, and that doesn't account for local factors. And in terms of physical capacity on the ground, whilst it's great that LABC are training up as many people as they can get through to a good quality standard, that's not going to work everywhere. The chances of one of my building inspectors in South Holland being ready for this are pretty limited, but then I don't at the moment have anything over 4 stories. But if somebody come in with a high-rise building, we haven't got the skill set in South Holland, and that's not to say my people ain't good at what they do. It's just high-rise ain't one of the things that they currently do. Thanks.
So just to push on the point about cost recovery, do you think it should be made a duty in this bill? Because there's a conflict between clause 13, which enables the regulator to direct a local authority to assist it, but then the supplementary clause 14 enables for the cost to be reimbursed but doesn't make it that duty. Should it be, you know, so?
It should be a duty for full cost recovery. Local authorities are already short on cash, and I don't think anybody doubts that. Even our own Secretary of State recognises it, particularly with the pressures of COVID. But nobody thinks that post-COVID, if we ever get post-COVID, all of a sudden the world's going to be full of lots of money for local authorities again. I think we're going to be under the financial cost for the foreseeable future, and any additional services that we need to provide should be fully funded. It's not in anybody's interest to design a very good safety system and then underfund how it's paid for. It must be fully cost recovered, or else we'll end up with half a system. People will avoid doing everything to the full potential that the law will allow because of the cost of doing so.
Yeah, and would you say should the structure allow for regional variations in charging, for example?
Definitely. Some areas are going to be able to deliver this service at a lower cost per unit than others because of the volumes that they'll be dealing with. Other areas, you know, wages are different in different places. The costs of not wanting to cast aspersions on the construction industry, but the cost of keeping an eye on some people is much more expensive than the cost of keeping an eye on some other people, and that does have a regional variation.
Thank you. I know we're very pressed for time. Does any of the other panellists want to add anything to those questions?
No, thank you.
If I may, you know, just to say, LABC has been spending about £3 million a year on qualifications, competency, ISO, etc. That's not sustainable. And also there is an issue, whilst we understand that charges will be able to be agreed between the regulator and building control for the work that it actually does once we start the new regime, there is a need to actually gear up in advance of the new regime so that we can hit the ground running and support the building safety regulator from day one. So we need some assistance. And so far, local authorities, and so certainly local authority building control hasn't had support in that way. So yes, some support would be very much welcome.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Moving on now to further issues around building control. Brendan Clark-Smith. Brendan.
Thank you, Chair. In a similar vein to what Rachel's just been talking about, now thinking more about the individuals within the new regime, are there already enough people within the system that have the necessary skills to fulfil the various roles? And not just around building control, but also accountable person and building safety manager during the occupation phase. Lord Porter, do you mind answering that one first?
Well, the answer to all of those questions and the ones that you haven't asked about the construction industry to deliver the product in the first place, the answer is no. That we don't have enough people who are yet ready. You just had a good explanation of what LABC are doing to try and get their teams ready. But if you rolled that out across the whole country, if we were able to deliver this bill within a few months, which I don't think you're going to be, I think this bill's going to be 3 or 4 years in the system before it becomes anything. We haven't got the capacity in any of the areas that are necessary. And on some of the bits, I still personally have concerns over some of the jobs are going to be so onerous. I'm not sure that anybody who is in sane mind would want to take some of them on.
Thank you. The capacity was going to be my next question, so thank you for that. Lorna, do you have anything to add to that?
Very briefly, you'll be glad to know. Competence is a new concept, I think, to the construction industry, more so to than those who've been involved in these meetings and working groups for the last 3 years. People still think qualifications are competence, they're not. I have a 25-year-old degree. I used to work in building control. On paper, I'm competent to work on a HRB. Believe me, I'm not anymore. So competence is something entirely different. It's not about book knowledge, it's about application of learning and experience. And I think we've got to, the whole industry needs to start to understand that and grasp that they're going to have to do things in a very, very different way in the future.
Thank you. Steve, do you have anything on that at all?
Yes, I mean, I think the competence point is fundamentally important. We have a well-established approach to ensuring that the skills and competence of our surveyors and inspectors is appropriate to the risk they're reviewing. And I think that needs to be extended across the whole market in the way that many others are seeking to do. And the competence point is a broader one across the whole construction industry. And where there are structural issues that work against it because of the fragmented nature and the long supply chain. So it is quite a challenge and won't be addressed quickly or overnight, but it's fundamental that it is grappled with to help improve the quality of what we build in the UK.
Thank you. And my next question was going to be, how does the bill improve competence levels in the building control sector? But also, are there any other issues that need to be considered in the bill? For example, things like professional indemnity insurance. Lord Porter, do you want to answer that one, please?
I would leave it to other people who are better qualified in this audience to talk about insurance.
Okay, thank you. Lorna?
Yeah, with regards to competence of building control professionals, absolutely it needs to happen. LABC massively supportive of this. We do see that there may be potential loopholes in the bill whereby not every building control surveyor may need to be assessed and regulated. We would like to see all practicing building control surveyors to be licensed to practice on whatever level of work it is that they're doing. I think it's an absolute basic necessity. I've been working with NHBC colleagues for quite some years now on the subject of competence, and they have worked on a license to practice within their organisation for many years, and I think it's something that the whole industry should absolutely have to have, and we should all be regulated. So whether we were working on a loft conversion or working on a higher risk building, we should be able to prove the competency and be registered to do that work. So absolutely vitally important that we close the potential gap in to do that work. So absolutely vitally important that we close the potential gap in the draft bill to ensure that the profession is regulated.
I do agree with that, and we do work with across the industry and with the industry and other providers on competence, and it's fundamental again. The license to practice approach we have is well established. There's strong oversight and reporting around that, and indeed sanctions where we find anybody that falls short. And everybody needs to embrace that, as the industry is seeking to do. In terms of professional indemnity for NHBC, we take that risk to our own balance sheet, to our own account. So that's not an issue for us, but it is an issue for other approved inspectors. We don't write PI, professional indemnity, for other companies, so the broader market, commercial market, needs to respond on that one, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Right, thank you very much, Brendan. Ben Everett, over to you for the final question. Ben.
Thank you, Clive. And I know now we're already into extra time, but instead of golden goal, we're going to go on golden thread. We know that golden thread is probably one of these ideas that it's so good we can't believe we've thought of it before. But probably the reason we haven't thought of it before is because it's probably very, very complicated. So what are the challenges to rolling out golden thread? What information needs to be included? And I think the crucial question is the bill sufficient in setting who has access to that information and how they can access it? I'm going to go to Steve, then Lorna, and then Gary at the end. So Steve, the three questions. How hard is it? And what information should be in it? And who should access that information?
Well, Ben, I'm probably not going to give it. I think other people are probably better equipped to answer this question. And we do agree with the approach to the golden thread and about duty holders being held to account. And if there are lessons to be taken across from the health and safety and CDM regulation type approach, then I think they should be deployed around building safety too. And the fundamental point about accountability has to be secure and stay solid right through that golden thread and the handover. So there mustn't be any ambiguity in the interface between one duty holder and another. And I suspect that needs a lot more detailed work. I'm an insurance guy rather than a building control or construction specialist, so I'll probably leave it at that if you don't mind.
Thanks, Steve. And Lorna, your thoughts on those three things?
Again, I've been asked three questions, can only remember the first one. How hard it's going to be. From our perspective and from a local authority perspective, it's going to be about the practical and operational sides of that. Trying to, we do not have one IT system across all local authority building control teams in England and Wales. We have 330 odd. Coupled that with all of the different fire and rescue service IT systems, plus the building safety regulator, plus all of our new duty holders, it is an enormous task and one that won't be settled overnight. And again, our previous panel, talked about we will be able to probably quite easily make this work on new build projects, future projects. The amount of cost implication of getting 12,500 existing HRBs to have that level of detailed information is going to cost a fortune. The platform is going to be enormous. Gaining IT access just for local authorities into that platform is going to be complicated. So it's a big puzzle, and I don't have the answer. I just know that it's going to be difficult. And that was the answer to your first question, and I have no clue what the others were. I'm ever so sorry.
Don't worry, Lorna, it's okay. The other two were what information should be in it, and in terms of accessing that information, has the bill got it right about the who and how?
As the previous panel said, you know, security's got to be a major issue with this. You know, residents need to have information. You know, they need to be able to understand what's going on with their building. And I can only imagine what it must be like to live in a huge building where there's work going on and you don't know what that's doing, particularly now where people are perhaps more enlightened than they used to be. So I think it's going to be vitally important that residents and people who are living in these high-risk buildings have some understanding and comprehension of what's going on around them, and that they're safe, whilst not having access to information that they don't need. Fire and Rescue Service obviously need access to the information for work during out of hours, or should incidents occur. So it's an ongoing. I don't think anybody's got the answer to the problem, particularly for existing buildings so far. But it'll be interesting to see what happens there, and I'm no expert.
Thank you, and I can summarise from that answer that that what information depends on the who accesses it and how, and vice versa. Gary, have you got anything to add to those points that have been made?
Just a couple of points. I mean, obviously, since morning of Grenfell, LGA's done quite a lot of work, and we've also met with quite a few people from abroad, from Australia and from America. And a couple of things strike me is, from a building perspective, I've always thought it's far too complicated to know everybody who's done anything on a building and all the component parts and all the rest of it. But the aviation industry managed to do it really well. You can track any piece of an aeroplane from where it's been, how many hours it's been up, who was the last person to touch it, who's ever touched it. And I think the pharmaceutical industry also does the same. So clearly there are lessons that we should be learning from other types of industry about how you do that picture. Somebody mentioned earlier about digital twins. I've just started to explore those because it's technology and I'm not very good at any of that sort of stuff, so I kind of resist it. But the possibilities do look like if we can trust the technology and have people who are capable of exploiting it to its full potential, I think there's a really good chance that we can actually map new buildings going forward for every single component part and every single person who's ever worked on them. So I think it's possible for the new stuff. I don't think we've got a flying chance of doing the retro stuff because it's just going to be too immense. But at least let's go forward in a better way. And who should have access to it? Whoever needs to, given a circumstance at any particular time. And that's somebody well above my pay grade to work out who should be able to do it. I do know when people were asking to identify the buildings with ACM on, we were very reluctant to do that because that allows people with bad intent access to information that you wouldn't want them to have. So the security around any information about a building is going to be very important, that it's restricted to only those who need to know in times that they need to know it, I think.
Thank you, and I think that that answer underlines the fact that we need possibly a whole new skill set in the administration of this new legislation at a local government level as well, which is again another sort of burden being shifted onto local government as a result of new legislation. Thank you all three of you, and over to you, Clive.
Yes, again, just to reiterate the committee's thanks to all three of you for giving those answers to us. That certainly provided very helpful evidence and information for the committee to consider in terms of producing a report on this draft legislation. So thanks again. Order. That brings us to the end of our public proceedings for today.